By the numbers, New Hampshire is not the most diverse state. That is changing, and in the process, the state seems to be evolving in different directions at the same time, from the Attorney General's office standing up to hate groups by charging civil rights violations to the ongoing debate over what kind of concepts and ideas are acceptable in public school classrooms. There is always a lot to discuss on this topic, but we're lucky to be able to talk about it this morning with James McKim, president of the Manchester NAACP. James, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
So we had Education Commissioner Frank Edelblut on last week, and he is, of course, a staunch defender of the anti-discrimination law, which some people call the divisive concepts law, which essentially has its origin story in an effort to squelch out critical race theory in education and government training and things like that. Right. From your perspective, though, what has been the impact of this law now 18 months in?
What we've seen is a chilling effect in the education system. We have teachers and administrators who we know have said to us, we don't feel comfortable making comments about the protected classes, particularly race. So there are an increasing number of reports that we get about discrimination, and the ultimate that just happened, well, happened in May, was a death threat written on a bathroom wall of a school by a student. And the teachers in the administration felt that they couldn't really do much to address that in a very public way because of the act that you mentioned.
When you heard about that, what were you telling them? Were you trying to say, well, can you at least try? But they're worried about getting sued.
Well, we are here to support the victims.
Right.
So I really tried, and we really tried to not reach out to the school immediately, right, but to give the parents advice on what to do. So we didn't get involved immediately and talk with the school. I did attend, though, a school board meeting just last Friday evening where the school board recognizes that it has an issue, that it could have done better with the situation, and they're now seeking help, which is a good sign, actually.
And the idea is that you want to educate in these moments rather than just bring the hammer down in a complete punitive way, especially when they're under 18, right? And try and change some hearts and minds. And the educators are saying, we didn't think we could actually go that far this time around.
They didn't know what to do. And so to your point about not being punitive, I'm a big proponent, and we're big proponents of the notion of restorative justice, where we bring the community together to talk about the trust that's been broken and what the community feels is the best response to this and the best to rekindle the relationship that's been broken.
We also had this incident in Portsmouth where a National Socialist club hung a banner that said, "Keep New England White." The Attorney General now charging a couple of the individuals who were involved in that with civil rights violations. What do you think of this effort?
I think the Attorney General's office is doing exactly the right thing. I've had conversations with the AG, with Sean Locke, and they're stepping up the effort, I think, very appropriately to address this issue, which is it's the question of freedom of speech and where should that speech be explored and how far can it go.
When you have institutions taking a stand, even if it is going to court, that's an important thing, isn't it?
That's a very important thing, because that institutions, especially those that represent us, government by the people, for the people, we want that voice, and that is our voice, being heard through the power of the government.
Some statistics, and I'm sure you're familiar with these. Hate crime reports quadrupling in New Hampshire since 2018. 40 complaints for discrimination or hate crimes reported in 2018. In 2022, there were 187. What do you think is behind this rise? Do you think there's a certain level of maybe some of this was happening and more people are willing to come forward, or are we just seeing all around kind of a growth in that unfortunate field? I
think it's a little bit of both. We have more reporting mechanisms, and the mechanisms are known, so people are reporting them. But also, I think what we're seeing is what a colleague of mine called the last throes of white supremacy. It's the notion that that people are going to lose, that white people in particular are going to lose the privileges, even though they may not recognize them as privileges. They're going to lose their way of life. Our society is built on what we call white normativeness, where white is the norm. And you walk into a grocery store and you can expect, or any store, and you expect products to be there that will work for you, whereas people of color can't necessarily do that. But that's really a privilege, the fact that the society is built around white people. So it's a way of life, it's a fear of not being dominant, not being focused on, and so I think more people are rebelling against that in more violent ways.
Let's talk about the diversity argument in the New Hampshire primary. What are your thoughts on this idea that there just aren't enough people of color in New Hampshire, and this is just on the Democratic side right now, to continue having New Hampshire vote first?
So a couple of thoughts I have there. One is there's a notion that there is a state that has the diversity that matches the rest of the nation. And if you look at the demographics of the other states, they don't have it either. Right? So that's one point that I think is a kind of a fallacy with that argument. But another point is we tend to look at states and the demographics of the state, and we miss the hyper-local nature of things. So if you go to Census Tract 15 in Manchester, the statistics are flipped. You get like 60% people of color versus the 40% white people. So we have the ability, even in New Hampshire or at any state really, to look at the racial demographics and see where different races might come out in a primary, any opinion poll. So I think the notion of using race for this is really not what we should be doing.
You know, on social media, and it's dangerous to draw any example from social media, I know, but I'm going to go there.
Right.
You see these people who are already kind of standing at the ready to portray New Hampshire as kind of a neo-segregationist state if it simply goes through with holding the primary in defiance of DNC rules.
Right.
You know, setting up the conditions to portray a civic tradition which really embodies kind of the original diversity, equity, and inclusion. Everyone's welcome, everybody participates. To try and cast that as a kind of racial insult, that seems like it could be a dangerous precedent.
Well, it is a dangerous precedent, and it takes us further down into the divisive conversation about race and pitting one race versus another. And so what we really should be doing is stepping back and saying, well, what are the qualities of New Hampshire? What are the other qualities of New Hampshire that make it the best place to have the first in the nation primary? If we, in fact, maintain that we need to have New Hampshire as the first in the nation primary. There's discussion about why New Hampshire should be the first, and much of it is around, well, we've always been that way, and look what we've done with Jimmy Carter, look what we've done with Bill Clinton. We've created the space where they became the comeback kid. But past performance, as we know, is not necessarily indicative of future performance. So as the demographics change, as the state changes, I think we should be thinking about what constitutes really the criteria for keeping us a first in the nation primary, and leave race out, well, don't leave race out of it, but it's not the
Part
primary
of the discussion,
factor.
but yeah, it's always an interesting one to discuss. Let's revisit a tragic moment, but a touchstone moment for America, the killing of George Floyd.
Yes.
It focused so much attention on an important issue and trying to build progress, and everybody seemed to say, hey, we need to do better here. But since then, it seems like we've entered a kind of detour in that we've gotten caught up in, you know, debates about rhetoric and words, woke and critical race theory and things like that. In your opinion, how do we refocus our attention on making progress on community as a nation?
I think that the focus should be on civil discourse. We're not really taught how to have civil discourse. We're not taught how to have conversations about difficult topics. So education, again, comes into real focus here. We need to educate everyone, youth and adults, and commit ourselves to having civil discourse. We need to promise to ourselves we're going to be civil and respectful in the way that we talk about even the difficult topics. And I think that's how we get out of this divisive concepts discussion and back to focusing on the issues.
As we wrap up here, what's one thing that worries you and one thing you're optimistic about?
One thing that worries me is that we are emotional humans and we're resistant to change, and that our emotions will take over our intellect. What gives me hope is, as we just talked about, the AG's office is stepping into these situations where hate crimes have come up, and even not just hate crimes, but discrimination has happened. And that's a signal that the government is stepping in and taking this very seriously.
Right. And certainly discussions continue, and as we observed on MLK Day the other day, the youth are very interested in this, and it's going to be interesting to see where they take all of this in the future.
Absolutely.
James McKim, thank you for joining us on Close Up. We always appreciate your perspective.
Thank you, Adam. Great to be here.